The world that produces Magneto and Professor X is not born in chaos. It emerges from a promise, a quiet belief that difference can be integrated, that power can be named and regulated, that fear can be educated into restraint. Before the conflict ever speaks its name, the terrain is already shaped by this assumption. Civilization appears stable. Institutions function. Moral language feels sufficient. Order stands, not as an achievement, but as an inheritance. Mutants arrive into this world as a variation rather than a rupture. They are anomalies within an existing structure that still believes it can absorb them. The dominant culture treats mutation as a problem to be managed, a deviation that might be corrected through understanding or containment. Violence is not yet the organizing principle. The system still believes in dialogue. It believes in progress without fracture. Within this landscape, Charles Xavier does not present himself as a revolutionary. He occupies the center. He believes in the promise of the existing order, even when that order hesitates to fully recognize him. His posture is one of faith and structure. Education replaces force. Visibility replaces secrecy. He assumes that moral clarity will eventually align power with justice. The world has not yet proven him wrong. Eric Lencher moves through the same world, but he does not stand at its center. He inhabits its edges, its afterimages, its forgotten corridors. The promise of order never belonged to him. The rules that stabilized the system were written after his exclusion, not for his protection. To him, the world does not feel unfinished. It feels decided. This difference is not ideological yet. It is perceptual. Two men looking at the same terrain see different architectures of power. For one, the city is a structure waiting to expand. For the other, it is a fortress already built, with walls that remember who was once trapped outside them. Before Magneto becomes Magneto, survival is not framed as strategy. It is memory. The weight of historical collapse sits beneath every moral proposal offered to him. Promises sound fragile. Universal ethics feel conditional. He does not reject peace. He doubts its durability. The system speaks of restraint, but he remembers how restraint failed when it mattered most. Xavier, by contrast, remembers a world that can still be taught. His faith does not come from naivety. It comes from a belief in continuity. He sees power as something that can be guided without becoming corrupted. The center to him is not a lie. It is a responsibility. He trusts that visibility and patience will transform fear into recognition. At this stage, there is no confrontation. There is alignment without agreement. The two men share intelligence, history, and even affection. Their bond forms within the shared acknowledgement that mutation changes the terms of existence. But what those terms demand remains undefined. The tension is present, but it has not found language. The world around them continues as if this question does not yet require an answer. Governments debate registration. Media narratives fluctuate between curiosity and alarm. Public attention flickers, not yet fixed. Mutants are spoken about, not with. Power circulates, but it does not yet crystallize. The real fracture lies beneath the surface. It exists in how each man understands protection. For Xavier, protection means integration. It means constructing institutions that prevent panic from becoming policy. For Eric, protection means leverage. It means ensuring that vulnerability never again becomes an invitation to annihilation. These positions do not yet collide because the system has not yet forced a choice. As long as the world remains undecided, both strategies can coexist. Hope and vigilance share the same space. Faith and suspicion do not yet demand separation, but the architecture is already under strain. The presence of mutants introduces a new scale of power that the existing moral language cannot fully contain. Control mechanisms appear reasonable on paper, but they carry an echo. Every registry looks like a list waiting to be misused. Every appeal to calm sounds like a delay tactic to someone who has lived through collapse. The terrain begins to shift subtly, not through catastrophe, but through pressure. Laws accumulate. Surveillance expands. Fear acquires vocabulary. The center tightens. The periphery notices first. Xavier continues to believe that the system can be educated faster than it can be corrupted. His position relies on time. Eric does not believe time is neutral. He believes it always favors the structure already in power. Waiting is not passive. It is a decision with consequences. This is where the conflict truly begins, long before helmets or schools or prisons. It begins as a disagreement about the ethics of survival within a world that claims moral authority while retaining the capacity for erasure. It begins as a question of whether power must ask permission to exist. Neither man sees himself as extreme. Both see themselves as necessary. Each believes he is preventing a future catastrophe. The difference lies in which catastrophe they fear most. For Xavier, the nightmare is a world where fear becomes destiny, where power isolates itself and confirms every prejudice aimed at it. For Eric, the nightmare is repetition, the return of a history that proves kindness insufficient when confronted with organized hatred. The world still appears calm. Cities stand. Institutions speak. But the ground is no longer neutral. The center and the periphery are drifting apart, pulled by incompatible readings of the same reality. The conflict is not yet visible, but it is inevitable. The question is no longer whether the system will fracture, but where the fracture will run. And when it does, these two men will not simply oppose each other. They will embody two answers to the same question. How does one survive in a world that has already proven it can turn survival into a crime? The origins of Professor X and Magneto do not function as backstory in the conventional sense. They operate as gravitational fields. Each man's history bends perception, ethics, and strategy long before conscious choice enters the frame. Their conflict is not the product of misunderstanding. It is the collision of two internally coherent systems, shaped by incompatible experiences of power. Charles Xavier is born into proximity with stability. Wealth, education, and social access place him near the center of cultural authority before mutation ever complicates his position. This matters not because it makes him blind, but because it gives him a baseline of continuity. His identity forms in a world where institutions exist to be trusted, even when flawed. He grows up believing that structures can fail without becoming inherently hostile. Mutation for Xavier is an addition to the self, not a rupture of belonging. His abilities expand his perception rather than threatening his place in the world. He experiences power as something that arrives with responsibility, not danger. From the beginning, his mind moves toward synthesis. Difference must be translated, not weaponized. Conflict must be mediated, not accelerated. Eric Lencher's origin operates in reverse. His entry into power coincides with absolute dispossession. He does not discover his abilities within a functioning system. He discovers them in the absence of one. Authority for him is not abstract. It is concrete, brutal, and lethal. It is something that arrives with uniforms, lists, and finality. The institutions meant to protect order reveal themselves as instruments of annihilation. For Eric, mutation does not add complexity to identity. It becomes the only thing that keeps identity intact. Power is not an ethical dilemma. It is the last remaining guarantee against erasure. His abilities emerge not as potential, but as necessity. Survival precedes morality. Memory precedes hope. This difference establishes the ethical asymmetry at the heart of their conflict. Xavier asks how power should be used. Eric asks whether power can afford restraint. One question assumes a future. The other assumes repetition. When the two men meet, their connection feels genuine because it is. They recognize each other as intellectual equals, as rare minds navigating an unprecedented condition. Their conversations are not debates at first. They are explorations. Each believes the other can be persuaded because each assumes persuasion is still relevant. Xavier interprets Eric's severity as understandable but incomplete. He sees trauma as a lens that sharpens perception while narrowing it. His instinct is not dismissal, but rehabilitation. If fear created Eric's worldview, then exposure to cooperation might dissolve it. Education is not only for children. It is for history itself. Eric interprets Xavier's optimism as dangerous but sincere. He does not doubt Xavier's intentions. He doubts the environment those intentions must operate within. To him, Xavier's faith resembles a luxury made possible by distance from irreversible loss. He does not resent this distance. He distrusts its conclusions. Their ethical divergence maps onto spatial metaphors. Xavier occupies the center and seeks to widen it. Eric stands at the boundary and seeks to fortify it. One builds bridges. The other builds walls. Both claim protection as their goal, but they define threat differently. The world around them accelerates this divergence. Mutants begin to appear more frequently. Visibility increases. Public discourse hardens. What was once theoretical becomes urgent. The system demands classification. Fear seeks clarity. Ambiguity becomes intolerable. Xavier responds by formalizing his vision. He builds a school. Education becomes architecture. The institution is designed not merely to train mutants, but to shape them into citizens. The school is both refuge and laboratory. It models a future where power integrates itself into the existing order without destabilizing it. This move is often mistaken for passivity. It is not. It is strategic containment. Xavier understands that uncontrolled power invites backlash. His answer is discipline without militarization. He offers structure as inoculation against fear. Eric reads the same move as premature exposure. Training mutants to function within a hostile system looks, to him, like conditioning them for vulnerability. The school feels like a spotlight. Visibility without leverage is not safety. It is risk. Their disagreement deepens as external pressure mounts. Governments propose registries. Media narratives sharpen. The center tightens its grip. What Xavier sees as negotiation, Eric sees as rehearsal. Each concession teaches the system how far it can go. Psychologically, the conflict crystallizes around responsibility. Xavier believes power must justify itself to the collective. Eric believes the collective has forfeited the right to demand justification. This is not nihilism. It is a recalibration of moral priority. Survival precedes consent. The ethical fault line becomes impossible to ignore when violence enters the equation. Acts of aggression against mutants do not surprise Eric. They confirm him. For Xavier, they represent deviation, not destiny. He believes escalation can still be prevented. Here, their internal structures fully reveal themselves. Xavier's strategy depends on trust in gradual transformation. Eric's depends on readiness for collapse. One prepares for reconciliation. The other prepares for war, not because he desires it, but because he believes history does. The rivalry that forms between them is not driven by envy or mirrored desire. It is driven by incompatible temporal orientations. Xavier is oriented toward a future that has not yet arrived. Eric is oriented toward a past that refuses to stay buried. Both claim realism. Both accuse the other of blindness. As their paths diverge, they stop sharing space. The conversation fractures. Distance replaces dialogue. The system no longer allows ambiguity. Mutant identity begins to organize itself around poles. Neutrality erodes. What began as a philosophical disagreement becomes structural opposition. The world demands alignment. Xavier aligns with the hope that systems can be reformed from within. Eric aligns with the certainty that systems reveal their true function under pressure. Neither position is abstract. Each is lived. Each carries cost. Each produces followers who inherit the same assumptions. By the time open conflict becomes inevitable, the foundations are already set. The tragedy is not that they fail to understand each other. It is that they understand each other too well to believe compromise would survive contact with reality. The conflict is no longer personal. It has become architectural. Two visions of survival now compete to define the future of an entire species. And the world is watching, whether it understands what it is seeing or not. The conflict takes shape not through a single decisive event, but through accumulation. Pressure replaces dialogue. Observation replaces trust. What once felt like a shared project begins to fracture into competing interpretations of the same reality. The world does not suddenly turn hostile. It becomes legible. Early confrontations between mutants and human authority are framed as anomalies. Isolated incidents, failures of communication. Xavier treats each rupture as evidence that more structure is needed, not less. He responds by refining discipline, emphasizing restraint, and tightening the ethical boundaries within which power may operate. The school evolves from sanctuary into training ground. Control becomes a moral obligation. Eric watches these same developments with a different calculus. Each incident confirms a pattern he already knows. Violence does not erupt because of misunderstanding. It erupts because power invites fear, and fear seeks elimination. To him, restraint does not neutralize hostility. It delays it. Every act of compliance teaches the system how to escalate more efficiently. The first visible clashes reveal this divergence with clarity. When mutants are threatened, Xavier insists on proportional response. Intervention must never justify retaliation. The goal is to de-escalate, to prevent the narrative from hardening into inevitability. He believes that how power responds in moments of crisis determines whether it will be tolerated long term. Eric intervenes differently. He does not seek spectacle, but he does not avoid it either. His actions are decisive, public, and unmistakable. They are designed to communicate a boundary. The message is not revenge. It is deterrence. He wants the world to understand that vulnerability is no longer available for exploitation. These early actions reshape perception on both sides. To human institutions, mutants cease to be an abstract concern. They become an unpredictable force that must be monitored. To mutants themselves, the question of protection becomes urgent. The idea of neutrality begins to feel hollow. Psychologically, this moment marks the end of shared interpretation. Xavier still believes that meaning can be negotiated. Eric believes meaning has already been assigned. Power now functions as language. The only remaining question is who speaks it fluently. The rivalry sharpens as each man begins to attract followers. Xavier's students are drawn to his promise of coexistence, not because it is easy, but because it offers legitimacy. His authority is paternal, grounded in guidance rather than command. Loyalty emerges through identification, not fear. Eric's followers gather for different reasons. They recognize in him a refusal to apologize for survival. He does not offer reassurance. He offers certainty. His authority is magnetic because it externalizes rage without dissolving it into chaos. He gives form to a resentment that has never been acknowledged as rational. The emergence of these factions is not immediate, but it is inevitable. Identity begins to organize around interpretation of threat. Those who believe the future can be negotiated gravitate toward Xavier. Those who believe it must be seized gravitate toward Eric. The center thins. The boundary hardens. Public perception accelerates this process. Media narratives simplify the conflict. Complexity collapses into binary. Peace versus extremism. Hope versus terror. These frames do not describe reality, but they structure response. Visibility amplifies tension. Every action becomes symbolic, whether intended or not. Xavier understands this and attempts to manage narrative. He speaks publicly. He emphasizes responsibility. He frames mutant power as compatible with human norms. His goal is not persuasion alone, but containment of fear. He believes that perception, once stabilized, can prevent escalation. Eric rejects this premise entirely. He sees narrative as a tool of control, not understanding. Visibility without power invites manipulation. He does not seek to be understood. He seeks to be undeniable. His actions disrupt the frame rather than operate within it. This divergence produces the first irreversible consequences. As confrontations intensify, casualties appear. Loss enters the equation. Each side interprets loss differently. For Xavier, loss is evidence that escalation must stop. For Eric, loss is evidence that escalation was inevitable. The psychological transformation is subtle but profound. Xavier begins to internalize responsibility not only for his own actions, but for the actions of all mutants. He feels compelled to restrain even those who resist restraint. Order becomes heavier. The center becomes burdened. Eric experiences the opposite shift. Responsibility narrows. His focus tightens around survival of his group. Moral weight redistributes. The collective takes precedence over universal appeal. Protection becomes selective by necessity. The world responds predictably. Institutions strengthen surveillance. Legislation tightens. Fear acquires infrastructure. What began as reaction becomes policy. The system adapts to the presence of mutant power by preparing for its containment. This is the moment where the conflict ceases to be philosophical. It becomes structural. Xavier is now positioned as intermediary between power and authority. Eric positions himself as opposition to authority itself. Both roles are defined by the same pressure, but they respond in opposite directions. The tragedy of this movement lies in its logic. Each step follows naturally from the last. There is no betrayal, no misunderstanding, only interpretation hardening into action. The arena is set. The boundaries are drawn. The conflict has found form. And from this point forward, retreat will no longer look like peace. As the conflict deepens, the terrain itself begins to change. What was once a series of confrontations becomes a system of anticipation. Both sides stop reacting and start preparing. The future is no longer imagined. It is modeled. Power reorganizes around prediction rather than response. Xavier's role evolves under this pressure. The school expands in scope and function. It is no longer only a place of education. It becomes an early warning system, a moral filter, and a stabilizing center designed to absorb shock before it reaches the public sphere. Information flows inward. Decisions concentrate. The burden of foresight grows heavier. This concentration of responsibility subtly alters Xavier's posture. His commitment to restraint remains intact, but it now carries an undercurrent of control. He must decide who is ready to act and who must be held back. His authority becomes structural rather than inspirational. The center begins to harden. Eric observes this transformation without surprise. To him, it confirms a pattern he understands well. Power, once centralized, does not remain neutral. Even benevolent authority produces hierarchy. Even ethical leadership generates exclusion. The difference lies not in intention, but in outcome. In response, Eric's operations become more coordinated. What once felt like reactive defense acquires strategic depth. Targets are chosen carefully. Symbols matter. He does not attack randomly. He attacks meaning. His actions aim to fracture confidence in the system's ability to protect itself. Each intervention sends a signal. Boundaries are not requests. They are enforced realities. He wants institutions to understand that escalation carries cost. Not as threat, but as fact. Power meets power. The language becomes unmistakable. This phase marks the emergence of true polarization. Mutant identity no longer floats between possibilities. It begins to congeal around allegiance. Neutrality becomes dangerous. To refuse alignment is to accept vulnerability. The pressure to choose intensifies. Within Xavier's circle, dissent grows quietly. Some students question restraint. Others fear becoming instruments of containment rather than agents of change. The promise of integration begins to feel asymmetrical. Sacrifice is expected primarily from those who are already exposed. Xavier hears these concerns, but his calculus remains bound to prevention. He believes that fracture would invite catastrophe. His fear is not of Eric, but of what open war would authorize in return. He carries the image of collapse as something that must be avoided at all cost. Eric carries a different image. Collapse is not hypothetical. It is historical. The system does not need permission to destroy. It needs opportunity. Waiting does not prevent disaster. It prepares the ground for it. The conflict between these visions manifests most sharply in moments of crisis. When threats escalate, Xavier seeks containment and secrecy. Public exposure must be minimized. Order must appear intact. The illusion of stability is treated as protective. Eric deliberately disrupts this illusion. He understands visibility as leverage. When power is exposed, it forces recalibration. Fear must be confronted, not managed. He does not seek chaos for its own sake. He seeks clarity. This dynamic transforms the public arena. Media attention intensifies. Narratives simplify further. Magneto becomes symbol before person. Professor X becomes institution before individual. The men themselves recede behind the roles they now inhabit. Psychologically, this produces a narrowing on both sides. Xavier's empathy becomes abstract. He cares for mutants as a category, a future population that must be protected from itself as much as from others. Individual rage becomes something to be regulated. Eric's empathy narrows in the opposite direction. He focuses on those who share his vulnerability and his memory. The universal dissolves into the concrete. Moral obligation contracts around survival of the threatened group. Neither transformation is chosen freely. Each is produced by pressure. The system does not reward nuance. It rewards coherence. Both men become more internally consistent and therefore more incompatible. The conflict reaches a threshold when containment fails publicly. A single breach exposes the fragility of the system Xavier has been sustaining. Panic spreads. Authority responds with force. The center reveals its limits. For Xavier, this moment is devastating. It confirms his fear that escalation breeds escalation. He doubles down on restraint, even as it isolates him from those who now see restraint as submission. His authority becomes strained. The center fractures internally. For Eric, the breach confirms everything. The system responds exactly as predicted. Fear converts into control. Control converts into violence. His position hardens into certainty. Compromise now feels indistinguishable from betrayal. The world absorbs this moment as a turning point. Trust erodes. The language of coexistence weakens. The possibility of synthesis fades. What remains is opposition. By the end of this movement, the conflict is no longer about tactics. It is about ontology. Two incompatible understandings of reality now occupy the same space. One believes order can still be taught. The other believes order reveals itself only when challenged. The stage is set for open rupture. The weight of accumulated decisions presses forward, and the system begins to buckle under the strain of holding both visions at once. The rupture does not arrive as surprise. It arrives as release. What has been compressed by restraint and anticipation finally finds direction. The conflict steps out of abstraction and into open space, where consequences can no longer be managed quietly. The arena becomes visible. The world is forced to watch. When open confrontation emerges, it carries the weight of everything that preceded it. This is not eruption born of impulse. It is the visible outcome of incompatible structures colliding under sustained pressure. Each action now carries historical charge. Every decision echoes backward as justification and forward as precedent. Xavier enters this phase with reluctance that no longer functions as caution. It becomes resistance to inevitability. He still believes escalation can be shaped, but the tools available to him have narrowed. Dialogue no longer stabilizes. Authority no longer reassures. The center he has guarded begins to feel exposed, surrounded by forces that do not share its language. His response becomes paradoxical. To prevent catastrophe, he must exert more control. To preserve freedom, he must impose limits. What once felt like ethical guidance now feels like command. The structure he built to educate begins to resemble a mechanism of containment, not because it was designed to oppress, but because pressure reveals function. This is the moment where Xavier's vision encounters its shadow. The belief that power can be held in check through moral clarity alone proves insufficient when fear accelerates faster than reform. The center cannot expand quickly enough to absorb what is coming. It tightens instead. Eric moves through this phase with clarity that borders on calm. The escalation does not excite him. It confirms him. The world has chosen its posture, and he responds in kind. His actions now carry the weight of leadership rather than defiance. He does not simply oppose authority. He replaces it within his sphere. His movement becomes territorial, not in the sense of conquest, but in the sense of boundary. He defines spaces where mutant power is not negotiated. These spaces function as counter-centers, organized around protection rather than permission. The periphery becomes organized. The boundary acquires structure. This transformation alters how violence is perceived. Under Xavier's framework, violence is failure. Under Eric's, violence is communication. Not chaos, but statement. Each confrontation redraws the map of what can be done without consequence. The world responds predictably. Governments escalate. Surveillance expands into preemption. Fear no longer waits for proof. Suspicion becomes policy. The system reveals its true architecture, not through malice, but through efficiency. Control becomes justified by speed. For Xavier, this is the final confirmation of his deepest fear. Escalation legitimizes repression. Every act of force narrows the future. He sees the wall rising, and he knows that once complete, it will not distinguish between defensive and aggressive power. All will be contained. For Eric, the wall has always existed. What changes is visibility. The structure that once hid behind language now stands exposed. He does not see repression as response. He sees it as default. The conflict strips away pretense. The personal bond between the two men fractures completely here, not through betrayal, but through exhaustion. The shared past loses leverage against present necessity. They no longer argue. They act. Each believes the other has crossed a point of no return, not morally but structurally. Their confrontations now function as symbolic events. They are no longer about immediate outcome. They are about definition. Each clash answers a question posed by the world. Who decides the terms of survival? Who bears the cost of restraint? Who inherits the future? Xavier's presence in these moments becomes emblematic of ethical burden. He carries the weight of everyone who hopes for integration, even as that hope weakens. His authority depends increasingly on persuasion without power, a position that grows fragile under pressure. Eric's presence becomes emblematic of refusal. He refuses erasure. He refuses apology. He refuses the demand to prove his right to exist. His authority draws strength from clarity rather than consensus. The cost of this polarization is immediate and irreversible. Mutants are harmed. Humans are harmed. Trust collapses. The space for complexity disappears. Each side becomes simpler, sharper, more predictable. Psychologically, both men undergo a narrowing that solidifies identity. Xavier becomes the guardian of a moral center that may no longer exist. Eric becomes the embodiment of survival through opposition. Neither position allows retreat without collapse of meaning. By the end of this movement, the conflict has reached saturation. There is no escalation left that would change its nature. The system has revealed its limits. The characters have revealed theirs. What remains is not resolution, but consequence. The conflict has carved itself into the structure of the world. It will not end with victory or defeat. It will continue as condition. Once the conflict between Magneto and Professor X settles into permanence, it stops functioning as a story about individuals and begins operating as a cultural structure. It migrates outward. The narrative no longer belongs only to the characters who enact it. It becomes a framework through which audiences interpret power, trauma, morality, and survival. The fiction opens into a larger arena where symbolic alignment matters more than plot resolution. At this stage, Magneto and Xavier are no longer simply leaders within a fictional world. They become reference points. Each represents a coherent posture toward history and threat. The audience does not merely observe their conflict. It participates in it by recognizing familiar tensions embedded within contemporary life. The story offers no neutral ground because culture itself rarely does. Magneto's position resonates wherever historical trauma remains unresolved. His refusal to trust institutional morality speaks to communities for whom protection has always arrived too late. He embodies the memory that systems often define justice only after violence has already occurred. His presence in the cultural imagination gives shape to a suspicion that many already carry, but rarely see legitimized. Professor X occupies a different symbolic role. He represents the belief that continuity can be preserved even after rupture. His insistence on restraint mirrors the hope that moral frameworks can be expanded without collapsing under the weight of difference. For many, he reflects the desire to believe that history can be redirected rather than repeated. The power of the conflict lies in the fact that neither position is caricatured. The narrative refuses to render either man irrational. Each is internally consistent. Each responds to real conditions. This structural integrity is what allows the conflict to persist culturally. The audience is not asked to choose a hero. It is asked to recognize itself. Culturally, the story becomes a map of polarization. It reveals how societies fracture when fear accelerates faster than trust. The mutant question functions as a mirror for any group that suddenly becomes visible within a dominant structure that was never designed to include it. The anxiety surrounding mutation echoes older anxieties about difference that threaten established hierarchies. Media plays a crucial role in amplifying this tension. Within the narrative, public perception collapses complexity into spectacle. Outside the narrative, audiences experience the same compression. Magneto becomes a symbol of extremism. Professor X becomes a symbol of idealism. These simplifications are not accidents. They reflect how modern visibility systems reward clarity over nuance. This process transforms the conflict into a moral shortcut. Viewers align instinctively, often without realizing that their alignment reflects their own assumptions about power and vulnerability. Those who trust institutions gravitate toward Xavier. Those who distrust them gravitate toward Magneto. The story functions as a diagnostic tool, revealing ideological posture through emotional response. The symbolic territory expands further when the conflict is read through the lens of collective identity. Mutants cease to represent only themselves. They become a stand-in for any group navigating conditional acceptance. Their struggle reflects the cost of visibility in a culture that equates difference with threat. Magneto's insistence on separation and self-determination resonates in contexts where assimilation has historically meant erasure. His fortress-like vision of protection speaks to the need for spaces where identity is not negotiated. These spaces are not utopian. They are defensive. They exist because the center has proven unreliable. Professor X's integrationist vision speaks to a different cultural impulse. It reflects the hope that shared values can outpace inherited fear. His school symbolizes the belief that education can neutralize hostility before it hardens into policy. It is an optimistic model, but one that depends on time and goodwill. The conflict exposes the fragility of both impulses. Isolation risks stagnation and perpetual opposition. Integration risks dilution and vulnerability. The narrative refuses to offer synthesis because culture itself has not found one. The tension remains unresolved because it mirrors an unresolved social condition. Symbolically, Magneto and Xavier function as opposing gravitational forces. They pull identity in different directions, one toward consolidation and defense, the other toward expansion and exposure. Individuals caught between these forces experience fragmentation. The pressure to choose intensifies. This dynamic explains why the conflict persists across decades of storytelling. It adapts to new historical moments because its core tension is structural rather than topical. The names change. The context shifts. The question remains: what happens when survival and morality appear to demand different strategies? The story also reveals how trauma operates at a collective level. Magneto's memory of annihilation does not remain personal. It becomes transmitted through narrative. It shapes how entire groups interpret threat. Trauma becomes anticipatory. It influences action before danger fully materializes. Professor X represents the opposite transmission. He attempts to interrupt trauma's influence by reframing experience. He believes that if fear is understood, it can be disarmed. This approach appeals to cultures invested in therapeutic language and reform-oriented politics. It assumes that awareness precedes change. The friction between these approaches mirrors real-world debates about justice and safety. Should systems be reformed gradually or challenged directly? Is patience a virtue or a privilege? The narrative does not answer these questions. It stages them. The cultural impact deepens when the conflict is read as myth rather than allegory. Magneto and Xavier become archetypal figures. One embodies the guardian of the boundary. The other embodies the keeper of the center. These roles appear across cultures in different forms. Their recurrence suggests that the tension they represent is not temporary. The mythic dimension allows the story to bypass specific political contexts while remaining politically potent. It speaks to fundamental anxieties about who controls power and who defines legitimacy. The lack of resolution is not a flaw. It is the source of its endurance. Within popular culture, this unresolved tension invites endless reinterpretation. Different adaptations emphasize different aspects depending on historical mood. In moments of heightened insecurity, Magneto's logic gains sympathy. In moments of reformist optimism, Xavier's vision regains credibility. The narrative responds to cultural pressure without losing coherence. The audience becomes part of this cycle. Each generation rereads the conflict through its own experience of authority and exclusion. The story does not instruct. It reflects. Its value lies in its capacity to hold contradiction without collapse. Importantly, the conflict also reveals the cost of moral absolutism. Both figures risk becoming rigid under pressure. Magneto's clarity can harden into inflexibility. Xavier's restraint can calcify into control. The narrative warns against purity by showing how even ethical positions can become oppressive when insulated from challenge. This warning is subtle but persistent. The story does not argue against conviction. It argues against blindness. It suggests that any system, whether built on protection or integration, becomes dangerous when it stops interrogating its own assumptions. The symbolic meaning of the conflict ultimately rests in its refusal to comfort. It does not offer a future where all wounds are healed or all fears dissolved. It offers a clearer view of the forces that shape collective behavior. By placing trauma and idealism in direct opposition without easy resolution, the narrative invites prolonged engagement. It demands that audiences sit with discomfort rather than resolve it prematurely. In this way, Magneto and Professor X function less as characters and more as lenses. Through them, culture examines its own contradictions. Through their conflict, the story exposes the ongoing struggle to reconcile survival with ethics in a world that rarely guarantees both. The myth endures because the question it poses has not been answered, and because each new attempt to answer it reshapes the terrain on which the next conflict will unfold. When the conflict settles into permanence, it does not conclude. It hardens. What remains is not peace or victory, but structure. The world reorganizes itself around the fracture Magneto and Professor X have exposed. Their opposition becomes a fixed axis, a fault line running beneath every future decision, shaping movement even when unseen. Professor X survives as an institution more than a man. His vision persists in frameworks, schools, councils, protocols. It lives wherever power attempts to justify itself through restraint and moral language. His legacy is not naive optimism, but disciplined hope, the belief that control can remain ethical if it is constantly questioned. Yet this legacy carries weight. It requires vigilance that never ends. It asks those who inherit it to hold power while denying themselves its full use. Over time, Xavier's position acquires an unintended gravity. What was once a flexible center risks becoming orthodoxy. His moral framework, designed to prevent abuse, can solidify into doctrine. The center, if left unchallenged, begins to resemble the very structures it sought to reform. This is not corruption by intent, but by sedimentation. Stability accumulates habits. Habits harden into rules. Magneto's legacy follows a different path. He endures as warning and permission. His image remains wherever survival demands refusal. He becomes a symbol invoked by those who believe that history does not forgive vulnerability. His logic continues to circulate because it answers a question institutions avoid. What happens when restraint fails? Unlike Xavier, Magneto does not leave behind stable structures meant to endure peacefully. He leaves behind a posture, readiness, suspicion, boundary. His influence appears whenever groups retreat from the center to protect themselves. It is activated in moments when trust collapses faster than reform can respond. Yet Magneto's legacy also carries risk. Opposition that defines itself solely through resistance risks becoming permanent exile. When survival becomes identity, the horizon narrows. The boundary protects, but it also confines. The fortress defends, but it can never become a home. Together, these legacies form a closed circuit. Each corrects the other without resolving the underlying tension. Xavier's vision limits excess by insisting on moral accountability. Magneto's vision limits complacency by exposing the cost of faith. Neither can eliminate the need for the other. Culturally, this unresolved state is the point. The conflict does not instruct audiences how to choose. It teaches them how to recognize the price of every choice. Integration without vigilance risks erasure. Resistance without reflection risks isolation. The story refuses synthesis because synthesis would misrepresent reality. As myth, the conflict matures. It detaches further from specific events and embeds itself in collective imagination. New stories echo its structure even when names change. The archetypes remain recognizable. The guardian of the center, the keeper of the boundary. Their dialogue continues across generations because the conditions that produce them persist. The aftermath is not silence. It is resonance. Each time a society debates security versus freedom, reform versus rupture, patience versus urgency, the same symbolic forces reactivate. Magneto and Professor X reappear not as characters, but as positions within the argument. This persistence explains why the conflict never truly ends within the narrative universe. Even when one figure recedes, the structure remains. New leaders inherit the same dilemma, framed by the same pressures. The system continues to oscillate because the problem is not leadership. It is condition. The final clarity offered by the story is not moral resolution, but structural recognition. Survival and ethics do not naturally align. They must be negotiated continuously, under conditions that rarely allow clean answers. Power always arrives before wisdom. Memory always outpaces reform. Magneto and Professor X endure because they refuse to collapse into symbols of good and evil. They remain psychologically intact, ethically legible, and tragically incomplete. Each sees something the other cannot afford to see without losing coherence. Their conflict becomes a permanent echo in the cultural arena, a reminder that history does not disappear when ignored, and that hope does not survive without cost. The world they shape remains suspended between fortification and expansion, between fear remembered and fear anticipated. The legacy is not closure. It is orientation, a map of forces that continue to shape how societies decide who belongs, who must wait, and who is asked to risk survival for the promise of a future that has not yet arrived. The conflict does not resolve because it describes the shape of the problem itself, and that shape remains.